Hey people, it's the early hours of the morning, and I've been watching a film that I'm very familiar with. I've seen many times. I first got it on VHS, actually way back in, it would have been about 2000 or the late 90s. So it's a film I'm very familiar with. The film is Braveheart. It's been a while since I've done a film review, so this seems as good as any. This is the DVD version. Braveheart, 1995. So just give the basic details and then talk a bit about this because there is a lot of talking points around this film. Um, so the film was released in 1995, the same year as Rob Roy, and that was a time when the issue of Scottish devolution was developing, and with that, Scottish nationalism to some extent. So both films had a big influence on that, and particularly Braveheart. It's directed by Mel Gibson, starred Mel Gibson, written by Randall Wallace, and largely taking inspiration from the poem The Wallace by a poet by the name of Blind Harry, who was writing in the 15th century. This is about 200 years after the events. So that's very important to understand that Blind Harry was writing long after the events. Budget of 65 to 70 million, and it made 213 million at the box office. It was commercially very successful. The soundtrack is by James Horner. Superb soundtrack. I'll come back to that. Has Mel Gibson in the title role as the Scottish outlaw and hero William Wallace, who's a figure who's sort of legendary in Scotland. I mean, he's a real person, but he has iconic status. And that's interesting. It's something I'll come back to as well. Other cast members in leading roles include Angus McFadden as Robert the Bruce. The late Patrick McGoohan played King Edward Longshanks, Edward the First of England, also known as the Hammer of the Scots. Catherine McCormick plays his young bride, Murren McClannock. Um, Brendan Gleeson as his friend Hamish. Peter Hanley, who I understand has done some television dramas, played the young Prince Edward, later to be King Edward II, who continued the wars with Scotland. And there's other supporting roles, well-known actors, Alan Armstrong, among others. It's a big cast, probably a lot of extras. Brian Cox as Argyle Wallace, that's another big name. Um, so basically, the film looked at the life of William Wallace, the Scottish outlaw who became greatly romanticised, and it's an epic film. Some very impressive cinematography. But the first thing to say about Braveheart is it is notoriously inaccurate. Now, like I said, I've known this film for a long time. I didn't watch it in the cinema. I was too young. It's a 15 certificate. I would have been too young at the time. I'm not sure when I first saw it, whether it was on television or what, but I got VHS as a birthday present. It might have been on my 14th or 15th birthday, and I loved the film back in the day. My family used to go, when we were in Northern Ireland, we used to go on family holidays to Scotland. We knew Wallace country well, so around North Lanarkshire, the central Scotland region, around Stirling, Falkirk, the Wallace Monument, which there's also a statue at the base of the monument, which is very much looks like Mel Gibson. We don't really know what Wallace looked like. There's a lot of different depictions of Wallace. There was actually another Scottish figure at the time who is nowhere near as famous as William Wallace, but may have been equally important, a man by the name of Andrew Mornay. Um, and it's important to understand a bit of the background here. They do touch on it in the film, but I think the film doesn't really go into how complex the dynastic struggle in Scotland was. So, in the late 13th century, the Scottish king, I think it was Alexander III, had died, and his one legitimate heir was a child, the Maid of Norway, and she died, I believe, on the crossing over. So basically, there was a power struggle, and there was this period of interregnum in the Scottish throne. And because the Scots couldn't decide among themselves, they invited Edward the First as an arbiter, which was common practice in the medieval period. Edward took advantage of the situation. Like many medieval kings, he was a war king. He was ruthless and ambitious. He wanted to expand his territory, and he did. I think his epithet of Hammer of the Scots is probably justified. The film definitely depicts him as a villain, and I think even a kind historian would have to concede that Edward was ruthless. For example, it's not depicted in the film, but there was an incident in Berwick, the great border town, known now as the Massacre of Berwick in 1296, where thousands were slaughtered. Now, I think some of the upper limits need to be taken with caution because I doubt that Berwick had a population of 17,000 in the 13th century. It's only 30,000 today. Nevertheless, it's clear that there was a large scale massacre in the town. So, this is just one example of the ruthlessness of Edward, and also in Wales. On the other hand, he did fortify, he did expand castle building in England and in Wales, um, and he expanded a lot of parliamentary institutions. So, he's quite a complex king to study, actually. Obviously, in Scots and Welsh eyes, he's a tyrant, but like many of the controversial figures in history, there's a duality there, there's a complexity there. He was a physically tall man, probably known as Longshanks for that reason, that he was unusually tall by medieval standards. Um, One thing that needs to be understood about this period, and I've been watching the film Outlaw King, focusing on Robert the Bruce, which is very impressive as well, the cinematography and so on. But both films, this is the one on Netflix, but both films, very much romanticize the Scottish struggle and basically make the English look like the bad guys. The reality is more complex because prior to what we now know as the Scottish Wars of Independence, Scottish kings had invaded England, or specifically King Duncan III. He invaded England in the 11th century some four times, culminating in the Battle of Alnwick in, I believe it was 1094. So, this idea that it was always overbearing England invading Scotland isn't the whole picture. There was ambitious kings on both sides, and the dynastic and feudal struggles within Scotland were just as bloody and just as cutthroat and just as treacherous as any of the wars with England. But this was a violent time. I've been doing a study tonight on all the battles of the First War of Scottish Independence, just the First War, and I've estimated that the death toll was around 60,000. So, these were bloody conflicts, some major battles. Um, but I do want to touch on some of the inaccuracies in the film because there are many. So, where does one begin? It is known that Wallace came from a Scottish noble family. Whether he could speak Latin, whether he was that sophisticated, whether he traveled to Rome and so on, I think that's pushing it. Um, it's possible, I guess, but I think it's pushing it. And that was very much to romanticize the character. I'm just playing in the background here, actually, Mel Gibson's audio commentary, which I've never watched in full. It's a long film; it's almost 3 hours long. So, um, but yeah, it pretty much shows Edward as betraying the trust of these Scottish nobles in in his arbitration to decide who would be the king, and very much taking advantage of the situation. That's historically accurate enough, but I think the film doesn't really it underplays how complex that dynastic struggle was. It focuses a lot on the romantic side of William Wallace. And I think, we're talking now about the passage of 700 years. We don't really know what sort of character Wallace was. Um, the film very much depicts him as a reluctant guerrilla leader who started off as a pacifist and was motivated by the murder of his young bride. That may be true, and it is true that he sacked the garrison at Lanark and killed the local commander, a man by the name of William Hazelrig. but there's a lot of things that are mistaken. In the first major battle depicted in the film, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where does one even start? The battle doesn't show the river, which was a very important part of the battle. It doesn't show the bridge. In fact, in the film, it just says Stirling. Um, the Scottish warriors are depicted with blue face paint. It looks impressive cinematically. Problem is, that is woad. It was a kind of plant mixture, and that was used in the Iron Age. It was used by Pictish tribes. So that's 1,000 years before. That would literally be like a film set today showing us in medieval armor. It also depicted kilts, which were at that time, I don't think they'd been invented, at least they weren't in common usage until the 15th century. So that's a major mistake. What the film did get right was the brutality of medieval warfare. You know, there was very little actual chivalry on the battlefield. It was brutal, it was bloody, and it was savage. That's true. The film did get that correct. And cinematically, it's very well shot. I can't fault that. It is cinematically impressive. Um, the character of Robert the Bruce is an intriguing one. It shows Bruce's personal struggles and twitching sides. He may have been with the English at Falkirk, but interestingly, Wallace himself may have even been in the English army at one point as a mercenary. Historians believe that his success in those early campaigns, he must have got that from somewhere. How could a low-level noble just rise from nothing to defeat one of the most powerful armies in Europe from nothing? So it does make you wonder if Wallace maybe had some previous military experience. He may have even been a mercenary in Edward's army. So that would definitely be an interesting take on it. Um, a major mistake is in the depiction of Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf of France, one of the most important women of the medieval period. Now, in the film, it depicts her as an adult woman. The truth is, when she was betrothed to Prince Edward, she was 3 years old. Even when they married, she was only 13. In the film, it shows her as a grown woman in, guess, her late 20s. Um, So that's definitely pushing it. Even more absurd is her romantic relationship with William Wallace. That is, there's no indication she even personally met Wallace, never mind had a romantic relationship with him. And that's no criticism of Sophie Marceau. Sophie Marceau is a great actress, and she is a stunningly beautiful woman. Um, she fitted the role in that sense of the beautiful French princess. But she was a grown woman, and the real princess was a child. She really came of age much later in the late reign of Edward II and Edward III. Um, Another controversial depiction is that of Edward II, the Prince of Wales. The film very much shows him as an effeminate man because there was long-standing rumours that he was gay, that he had a relationship with his favourite, Piers Gaveston. In the film, the character Philip is very obviously meant to be Piers Gaveston. The problem is it kind of gets into gay stereotypes. He's very effeminate. He's a bit of a pushover. He's a very lousy husband. This in the 90s you get away with that. Today it would be a bit, it's very stereotypical. I'm not saying that Edward couldn't have been like that, but in the end of the day, Edward, like his father, was a war king. He led military campaigns. He was personally in battles. So he can't have been that much of a pushover. Also, whilst it is true that Piers Gaveston was murdered, that happened much later, and there is no way that it was personally at the hands of the king. He would have ordered it, but in the film it depicts him as literally throwing him from the tower. It's cinematically, it's good drama, but it's just so absurd that would have happened in that way. Um, Another aspect is the Latin prima nocte, which was supposed medieval rites of well, it was basic rape. It was basically English officers would get to take a Scottish bride on the night of her wedding and to take his sort of feudal rights, but That's not known to have existed. It may just be a legend, but I guess that's one you could sort of be have a bit of artistic license with. Finally, there's a practical thing at the point where William Wallace is hung, drawn, and quartered in London, in Smithfield. It's accurate in terms of how brutal it was, but he shouts out freedom. Now, if you've just been disemboweled, that would be physically impossible. So again, it's romanticizing the legend, but it's physically impossible. Yet another mistake, the Battle of Bannockburn. It implies that it was a spontaneous battle rather than part of a pitched planned battle and part of Bruce's campaign later in the Scottish Wars of Independence. And that brings me to the final point, the Scottish Wars of Independence. Um, Today, and especially with the rise of Scottish nationalism beginning in the 20th century, it's been popular to depict this as a war of independence, much like the Indian Mutiny of 1857 in India is described as the First Indian War of Independence. Well, in both cases, that might be misplaced. In the case of India, India wasn't a unified state at the time. It was a collection of princely states that was largely controlled by the British East India Company. Now, in the case of medieval England and Scotland, concept of nationalistic wars only really came later. That's not to say that there wasn't deep patriotism involved, but I think it was a lot more complex than that. I think it was very much an overlapping with the Scottish dynastic feud. Um, because there would have been mercenaries in both armies. Yes, it was England versus Scotland, that's true. And there were many bloody battles fought in this part of the country around Northumberland and the Scottish lowlands, many. Thousands and thousands of men fell in these conflicts, but it was more complex than just England versus Scotland. The Scottish dynastic feud was a very, very big part of it, and there was battles at that time that was Scots against Scots. Um, and like I say, there was Scots in the English army, so there's different ways to look at it. There's a scene in the film actually where Princess Isabella she's having this meeting with Wallace and she sort of remonstrates, does that make you the sacker of peaceful cities like York? And he contends, well, York was the staging post for every attack on my country. But that kind of reiterates actually that, there was constant border war between the two sides, or near constant border war. It went right up to Flodden in 1513. In the end, England proved to be stronger. It's a bigger country. It had larger armies, generally speaking. Scotland had some notable victories. Um, One battle that's actually largely overlooked is the Battle of Roslin, 1303. Some contemporary sources suggest as many as 35,000 may have been slaughtered. If that's true, it's not only the bloodiest battle in Scottish history, it's the bloodiest in England or Scotland, even surpassing the Battle of Towton in 1461. Now, I think it's probably a bit exaggerated. However, there's an interesting theory as to why Rosalind is not better known. It's not depicted in either Braveheart or The Outlaw King. The Outlaw King depicts some of the skirmishes that Braveheart doesn't, such as the Battle of Loch Ryan, which is interesting. But yeah, the Battle of Roslin, it may be that the reason it's not better known, despite the massive casualties, is that Robert the Bruce had this feud with John Comyn, and this was part of Comyn's campaign, I understand. If I'm mistaken about that, someone could correct me, but it may be that after Comyn was murdered by Bruce personally in Dumfries Abbey, um, the Bruce faction wanted to downplay his role. Um, but I think even if 35,000 is an exaggeration, it's clear there was a major battle at Roslin. Um, but anyway, that's Braveheart. I do think it was somewhat used for propaganda purposes with the rise of Scottish devolution. I mentioned the soundtrack. I'll close with this. For me, it's one of the best things about the film. It's stunning. It's some of the best soundtrack listings I've ever seen in a film. which is very moving, very beautiful, especially the piece "A Gift of a Thistle," when the young Wallace is given a thistle by the girl who later turns to be his first bride. Turns out to be his first bride. Also, there's a piece of music. I don't know if there's a name to it, but it's featured in the wedding of Princess Isabella and Prince Edward. That's just a Gregorian chanting. I find that very relaxing. If you see the film, you'll know the scene I mean. So for Braveheart, it's hard to give it a ranking out of 10. On one hand, it's cinematically very impressive. It's good drama. It's good acting. Um, and the soundtrack's beautiful. But as a historic piece, the artistic license really is on another level. I mean, the number of inaccuracies, you could forgive one or two, but in the case of Braveheart, they go off the scale. There's just so many of them. Um, so I think I'd give Braveheart, in terms of a drama, in terms of cinematically, 7 or 8. In terms of accuracy, I'd say 4. Honestly, it's a weak film in terms of accuracy. They get some things right, but there is just too many mistakes to give it much ground in that. All round, it's a film that's worth watching. It's a film that done what it set out to achieve. I mean, it was successful, and for a long time, it was one of my favorite films. Over time, now that I've discovered how inaccurate it was, that has probably lowered its reckoning in my mind. But nevertheless, it's an impressive film. So I still would say it's a film worth watching. Check it out. Braveheart, 1995.